Unit 1-3, Data Tables and Graphs. So now that we've been able to gather data through using the scientific method, we need to make some graphs and data tables. Well, we should have an understanding of why we use data tables. We use data tables in order to gather data. And then we use it also in order to be able to display the data in a concise way. This would allow someone to be able to take that data, put it into a format that everyone can understand, and makes it easy for them to interpret what is going on. So a couple rules when we create our data table. Number one, we always should identify the table, whether it's table number 1, table number 2, so then we can correlate that graph to it. Underneath that table number, we need to include some sort of title. The title should pertain to what type of data that we're gathering. We should have columns, and each column should have a label and a unit with it. Just like when we take a measurement, we need to have a number and a unit. In this particular case, we have to have a label and a unit. We can't just say temperature. We have to say if it's in Celsius, Fahrenheit, or Kelvin. And our column should only be as wide as the largest number that we have. So we shouldn't make data tables that have columns that are extremely wide when we're only using single-digit numbers. So what should a data table look like? Well, first, as we've just said, we should label that data table, and we should call it table number 1 in this particular case. Then we need to give it a title. So underneath table number 1, we would write, in this particular case, let's pretend we're doing temperature versus time. So then over here we have to label our columns. So this one would be time. Again, we need to give it a unit. So that would be minutes. In this one, we would have, let's say we have temperature. I'm going to abbreviate that temp to make it fit in. And in science class, we always use Celsius or degrees Celsius. And we could have another temperature here. And of course, we're going to have the same thing, degrees Celsius. So this might be cup number 1 versus cup number 2. Now these columns might be a little bit wide, but we needed that in order to fit our title in. That's what a data table will look like. We'll come back and look at a graph in a minute. Let's talk about 4 different types of graphs that we could look at. First one is a pie chart. And what we're using a pie chart for is to show a proportion. And we're looking at that proportion of the whole thing. So in this particular case, we're talking about the fuel mix for U.S. energy generation. Next type of graph is a bar graph. And that is used for a comparison. That's a comparison. And that's when we don't have a large number of quantities. In this particular case, we're looking at a comparison of temperature versus, or year versus temperature. And this is the 10 coldest average temperatures in Burlington, Vermont. Next type of graph that we'll talk about is a line graph. And a line graph is going to show us a trend, or another way, and the Regents likes to use this word, is to talk about the relationship between things. The last type of graph is a combination graph. So we're using 2 different axes for this. We're using the left and the right. So the graph in this particular case is going to show temperature on our y-axis, which is a line graph, and they're going to show precipitation on the right hand side y-axis, and that's going to be a bar graph. So we're doing a combination, and you would see this a lot with climate graphs. So here we have climate for New York State, and we can show the months on our x-axis. Then what we look at is we can look at our key low, high, and precipitation. Our blue line, again, is using, and let me change the color here. Our blue line is over here. Our red line is using these numbers, and I'll use green for this one down here for precipitation, and here are precipitation numbers over on this side. So we have a combination of things that are occurring. So last in this, let me show you really quickly how I like to see your graph set up. First, when you set up a graph, you need to make sure you have enough room on your x and y axes. I generally say about 2 to 3 blocks depending on the graph paper, and that way when you set up your axes, then we did a data table earlier, we can say our time in minutes, and then let me scroll up a little bit here, and on this particular side we can talk about temperature in degrees Celsius. Then we can also label them. When we label things, if we start, and we're going to label for time, at 0 minutes, and start at 0, we have to be even increments. Each box has to equal the same thing. So if I take 2 boxes and label that 1, I have to go another 2 boxes and label that 2. Then another 2 boxes and label that 3. And continue on with that particular pattern. Oops, that should be a 4. And then 1, 2. And that would be 5. So we continue on. I can't make 2 boxes 1 and then say, it's not going to fit, and go 2, 3, 4, 5 and change. We have to be consistent in what we do. One of the things that's a little bit different from math and in science is in science, you're allowed to start at any number you want on your y-axis. So if we go back and look at this particular data table that we created earlier, we can see our lowest temperature is 45 degrees. We shouldn't have to start at 0 and label 0 to 45 and have no data there. So in this particular case, we're only going from 45, and we should probably go up to about 55. So in this particular case, maybe we want to start at 40. And let's say we want to go by 2s. So now we go 42, 44, 46, 48, 50, and last but not least, we'll stop right here. We'll stop at 52. So then what we would do is then we would plot our data. But we're missing some information. First, we have to have a title for this particular graph. And we probably, because we have table 1, and table 1 compares to graph 1, we want to call this graph number 1, and we could also call it temperature versus time. Then we would plot our data, and depending on our data would depend whether we have a line graph or a bar graph. We'll do a couple different examples in class so you get some practice on creating graphs.